Okay, good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for joining us today and welcome to this Biodiversa Plus press event. My name is Coralie Verhagen and I am the Communication Officer for Biodiversa Plus, the European Biodiversity Partnership. And before we get started, I just have a few quick housekeeping announcements to make. So first of all, please know that this event is being recorded. We're using this mainly for internal reasons and to be able to reflect back on this event. Secondly, you are welcome to keep your video either on or off, but please make sure that your microphones are turned off. You will be able to turn your microphones on during the Q&A session. During the Q&A session, questions can be asked either through the chat or by using the hand raising function. And then after the event, we will circulate a short write-up of the press event, and any questions you may have after this can be addressed to me through our email that is shown on screen. So now that these few housekeeping announcements are out of the way, let's get started. So again, thank you very much for joining our press briefing on concrete actions for the sustainable use of biodiversity and consideration of biodiversity values. As you may be aware, the IBIS, or Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, will be holding its 9th plenary session next week. During this plenary, 2 major reports will be presented for approval. First, an assessment on the diverse conceptualization of the multiple values of nature and its benefits, which is commonly known as the values assessment, as well as an assessment on the sustainable use of wild species. So ahead of the launch of these 2 IBIS assessments, Biodiversa Plus wanted to put these into context and into perspective. As the sustainable use of wild species and the reflections on the different uses of biodiversity are among the main themes addressed by Biodiversa Plus, we wanted to take this opportunity to introduce concrete actions addressing these challenges. So today's session will be divided in 3 parts. So first of all, we'll get a short introduction of Biodiversa Plus and its links with the IBIS, given by Hilde Eggermont, the chair and coordinator of the European Biodiversity Partnership. Then we will put these new assessments into context and provide examples of actions identified through Biodiversa projects. This part will be led by Frédéric Lemaître, our Senior Officer for Science Policy and Society Interface, and will include presentations by Professor Snäll from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences and Dr. Dagmar Haase from the Humboldt University. We will also finish today's session with a Q&A that I will be moderating. So once again, thank you for joining our press briefing. And without further ado, I give the floor to Hilde.
Thank you, Coralie, and also good morning to all. I'm very happy to introduce you to Biodiversa Plus indeed. Biodiversa Plus is a network of ministries and agencies across Europe supporting excellent research on biodiversity with an impact both for society and for policy. It's one of the European co-funded partnerships established in the context of Horizon Europe, which is a new framework program of the European Commission. And so this European Biodiversity Partnership is actually the first of its kind. We kicked off already last year, and we will continue our work over the next 7 years. And it's not an entirely new structure because we are building on the legacy of its predecessor called Biodiversa, which is a network of research programmers and funders that have been promoting and also financially supporting biodiversity research for over 15 years now, mainly but not exclusively in Europe. Now Biodiversa Plus is composed of both research policy actors and environmental policy actors, so basically ministries and their agencies from 36 European and associated countries. And we are also closely collaborating with a few non-European countries, such as Brazil, South Africa, Tunisia, Morocco, and Taiwan. And we are part of the European Biodiversity Strategy 2030, specifically to build the bridge between science, policy and practice, and therefore also to help putting Europe's biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030. So most notably, Biodiversa will provide this overarching platform that will foster seamless collaboration, including for research and innovation programs, but also for biodiversity monitoring schemes, for which all the resources will be pooled between Europe, national and also local levels in an unprecedented manner. The partnership aims at a global budget of over 800 million euros by combining contributions both from partners and from the European Commission. And so this amplitude is quite big, and therefore we also hope that our impacts will be equally significant. Biodiversa has 5 main objectives that you can also see displayed on the screen, all of which have a very close tie with the work of the IPBES. First of all, we aim to promote and support research on topics that can lead to groundbreaking science, while also delivering outcomes that are of relevance for policy and for society. So very concretely, as we did in the past with Biodiversa, we launch annual calls for research proposals. And this will allow us to fund at least 30 transnational research projects each year, which are producing new science that can then feed into the IPBES assessments. But we also work the other way around. We are identifying knowledge gaps in the IPBES assessments so that these can be addressed in our Biodiversa Plus program and also in the call for proposals. And we take up this role not only for Europe, but also globally, as we are hosting part of the IPBES Secretariat that will, for example, also identify the gaps in the IPBES global assessment, as well as those in the 2 new assessments that will hopefully be adopted at the IPBES 9 plenary. A second major objective of Biodiversa is to improve the monitoring of biodiversity and ecosystem services across Europe. And we aim to do this, amongst others, by harmonizing the work of existing national and subnational biodiversity monitoring schemes, and these coordinated processes and also harmonized indicators will allow biodiversity data to be comparable across Europe. And so this will give us a better understanding of biodiversity status and trends and dynamics. And it can also directly feed into the IPBES global and regional assessments. And such data will, of course, also be indispensable for evaluating the implementation of new biodiversity strategies and frameworks. Then the third main objective of Biodiversa Plus is to help expand and also improve the evidence base for the development and the deployment of so-called nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions refers to the sustainable use and management of nature to meet societal challenges while also enhancing biodiversity. So, for example, protecting mangrove forests is a nature-based solution for climate change adaptation and mitigation, because mangroves are excellent carbon sequesters, and they can also protect coastal regions from erosions and storms, and also provide habitats for countless organisms. So these nature-based solutions, they are gaining traction in science and policy because they have great potential to tackle the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, and therefore also to contribute to societal transformation that is needed to turn the tide. And similarly, Biodiversa Plus also provides businesses with the knowledge and the tools to better assess the impact and dependency on biodiversity. And this type of work is, of course, also very strongly linked with the future IPBES assessment on business and biodiversity that will also be discussed at the IPBES 9th plenary session. And then, as its fourth objective, Biodiversa Plus promotes efficient science policy interfacing so that policy decisions can be taken on the basis of the best available knowledge. And within Biodiversa, we do not only aim to stimulate the dialogue between scientists, policymakers, and practitioners, but we also aim to promote the capacity of scientists to engage with policymakers and to understand their needs. And we also regularly provide IPBES with policy support tools and methodologies. And then last but not least, Biodiversa Plus has also a very strong international component, as we fully realize that Europe has a major impact on biodiversity, both in Europe, but also beyond, for example, through international trade. And for that reason, the engagement with IPBES, which is a global platform, is central to our work, and we'll invest also in capacity building activities for both our partners and for our scientists to get engaged. So in sum, over the next few years, Biodiversa Plus can help to further uncover new knowledge that is needed to make well-informed decisions. And we also look very much forward to continuing our two-way collaboration with the IPBES, and also to the 2 new assessments that will be launched at the IPBES 9. So with further ado, I now give the floor to Frédéric Lemaître. Frédéric is our Senior Officer for Science Policy Society Interfacing, and he will highlight a few concrete results and actions to which Biodiversa Plus is contributing to the topics of sustainable use and valuation in line with these 2 new assessments that will hopefully be approved at the IPBES 9. So Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hilde, and thank you to all of you for attending today. So as Hilde introduced, I'm going to briefly present the 2 new IPBES assessments. Without these being published or available yet, they are to be expected to be adopted at the end of next week by the IPBES plenary. So this is based on the public IPBES information and elements that generally relate to sustainable use of biodiversity and values topics. But maybe before I do so, I wanted to highlight that also, as explained by Hilde, we are a European level partnership with national and local members in it. And this is true also for the projects that our partnership funds to. They are tackling EU and world scale issues like those of the IPBES assessments, yet they are making this bridge with very concrete on-the-ground knowledge and solutions which are advanced together with the people and organizations directly concerned by these challenges. And I'm telling you this because it's exactly what we want to showcase from Biodiversa Plus to you today with the examples from Dagmar, Tord, and a few ones I will provide as well. It's really on the ground findings and solutions to challenges posed by major global scale issues like sustainable use of wild species or accounting for the diverse values of nature. And we're pleased to show how Biodiversa Plus contributes to bridging not only gaps in our understanding of how to better work with nature, but also across geographical scales from local implementation of the concept to upscaling these and contributing to high-level assessments and decision-making like those happening in the context of IPBES. Okay, so behind both topics addressed in the new IPBES assessments, we are faced actually with a same initial question of how to better account for nature in whether it be in our practices in using wild species or through values used in the decisions we make every day. So these 2 topics, on some aspects, they connect. For instance, valuing biodiversity promotes its sustainable use. However, the assessments are expected to be quite different from one another. One being about the practices, trends, and solutions for the sustainable use of wild species. The other being around methods for valuing biodiversity and better accounting for it in our decision-making. Okay, for the sustainable use of wild species, which we'll focus on first. So concretely, sustainable use of wild species, it refers to activities that use wild natural resources, managed to some extent or not, and using them in a durable way. Using species, it means fishing, logging, harvesting animals or plants, but also the so-called non-extractive uses, such as tourism and enjoying sightseeing in nature. And so this best assessment is expected to delineate current practices and trends in the use of wild species and provide insights into solutions for their sustainable use. A very concrete example of what Biodiversa Plus contributes to do on this topic resides with our buffer project, for instance. So a buffer is about marine protected areas, which are largely recognized as contributing to maintaining healthy fish stocks, and they are, which is key to the long-term prosperity of fishermen, and also, of course, the health of our oceans and biodiversity. With this in mind, Buffer looked into where and why MPAs are ecologically and socio-economically effective or not. So concretely, it means, do they work for nature, and do they work also for people and the economy around them? Just to set this in the wider policy context, you may be aware that there's a very concrete policy objectives on the percentage of marine protected areas to be protected, of marine areas to be protected. For instance, in the European Biodiversity Strategy to 2030, there are objectives of 30% of the EU sea, which should be protected by 2030. So that's an increase of 19% compared to 2020. And today you have only 1% of EU marine areas which are strictly protected, and the objectives set out for 2030 are that at least 1/3 of all the protected area, or 10% of the overall EU seas surface, should be strictly protected in the future. So you have an objective of 30% partial protection and 10% full protection for 2030. However, what Buffer showed, analyzing actually over 100 MPAs worldwide and verifying their findings on case studies across Europe with actual sampling, is that different levels of protection have very different levels of effectiveness, especially depending on where they are placed from one another and from fully protected areas. So what does this mean in practice? You can see here the figure, the different extractive uses and non-extractive uses they looked at. It's presented part of as a self-assessment tool for marine protected area managers that was developed by Buffer, and it looks at the different levels of protection in terms of fishing and with what means or what fishing gear. But also other activities like snorkeling, scuba diving, which are linked to the right to anchor or boat in marine protected areas. So you can see the decision tree here for marine protected area managers to understand where you are in terms of regulation of your marine protected area, on the level of regulation. And what Buffer showed using this typology and applying it across case studies worldwide is that actually the low levels of regulation that you can see on the right hand side here, from unregulated to weakly regulated extraction, so 6, 7, 8, they are never efficient for nature, these ones. And then you have moderate to high levels of use regulation in partially protected areas, which are largely ecologically efficient for nature and people only when they are placed close or adjacent to a fully protected area. So it means that when you have a partial protection and a sufficient level of regulation, at a moderate level of regulation, such a marine protected area is efficient if it's next to a fully strictly protected area. And actually, later on, buffer researchers were able to use these findings to inform the implementation of policy objectives in a very concrete way. And you've seen the figures for these objectives, the percentage figures, and they showed, for instance, in the Mediterranean, that 95% of protected areas there, which actually do not have sufficient regulations in place. So you have actually 6% of the marine area of the Mediterranean, which is covered by partially or fully protected areas. And actually, out of these, you have 0.23%, which are ecologically efficient, because otherwise they are often not placed adequately to have this ecological effectiveness, which so it gives you a clear insight into the importance on the one hand of planning networks and spatial distribution of marine protected areas, and also into what local to global research and innovation can bring to the table for actually effective implementation of policy objectives for nature and people. And to give you another example around sustainable use, this time with forests, for which you know there's a growing demand and a pressure on wood production, we have invited toward Snäll to introduce results from our Green Future Forest project and to highlight paths to sustainability that they are working on in this context. Tord, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. And so I will share my screen. Do you now see my screen? Do you now see my screen and presentation?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I will talk about sustainably rebuilding boreal forest green infrastructure. And we are working in a large landscape in northern Sweden, 100 hectares, as you can see here on the bottom. This is a very intensively managed landscape that's shown by this age distribution, where you see the bars to the left are higher than the ones to the right. So it's dominated by very young forests. And we wanted to investigate three alternative futures for this landscape, which differ in terms of the sustainability. The first one meant rebuilding the green infrastructure. While doing this, we made sure to deliver the expected global demand for wood. We also, this scenario was contrasted by two other scenarios. One where we made sure indeed to also deliver to the global wood demand and focusing on our economy, and then a third scenario where we only maximized forestry economy. For each of these scenarios, we also ask three questions. The first one is, which forest management fulfills the scenario objectives? What's the impact on forestry economy? And finally, what's the impact on species negatively affected by forestry? And this is indeed a matter of sustainably using the forest. So I start by presenting the results on forest management that reach the objectives of these three scenarios. They are shown here. Each row represents now a scenario. To the right, you can see the different management regimes that are used in these simulations 100 years into the future. They are ordered from high intensity clear-cutting forestry on top to decreasing intensities, reaching to reserves on the bottom, all set aside. On the x-axis here, you can see the proportion of the landscape that is managed with either of these management regimes. And what you can see very clearly is that the green infrastructure scenario, it means applying a more varied forestry. And in fact, as much as 30–40% at least of the landscape is chosen to be managed with methods that are less intensive than clear-cutting forestry and more alternative to what we do up in the north today, with more than 90% being clear-cutting forestry. So the next question then is, how does these different routes into the future affect forest economy? These are the findings here. In comparison with the reference scenario, the profit is 14% less if you aim to rebuild the green infrastructure of these intensively managed northern landscapes. If you increase the harvest levels a little bit more than that is expected by the demand, the future expected demand, you can reach 2% higher profit than in the other two scenarios. So the question is, well, what should be said is also that these varied forestry, it also increases the functioning, the resilience, and other services received by or delivered by forests. And I will next talk about the functioning in terms of biodiversity. How is the biodiversity expected to change depending on the routes taken here? I start with birds. Here you see the three figures showing the three different scenarios: the green infrastructure scenario, reference, and economy. And the y-axis showed the change compared to today of these four different bird species. As you can see, the green infrastructure scenario indeed makes all species increase in the future. This hazel grouse indeed increases in all of them, but you can see that the other three species, they show some dynamics into the future depending on which other scenario than the green infrastructure scenario you choose. And if you zoom in a little bit on the economy scenario, you see that actually it causes the Siberian jay to have problems to recover from already now low levels. As I said, these are important for the functioning of the forest ecosystem. And that is indeed also the case for wood fungi, which is the next group we studied. These have a very special and key role for the functioning of forest ecosystems. And what is different with the fungi is that since they are more local, I can now present results on what will happen in the production land, which is managed, and in the reserves. And these are what the results show concerning the production land. If we choose the green infrastructure route forward into the future, you'll see that all species will increase. These are species that is already now red listed, some threatened to extinction. So it is a very positive trajectory that we see here if we adopt the green infrastructure route into the future. The picture is very different if we choose the reference or the economy scenarios, where some species indeed are projected to decrease further. How about in reserves? Well, here the development is very positive. The deadwood builds up on which these species rely on, and we simulated the same scenarios for all, the same projections for all scenarios, so they look all the same. So, in summary, boreal green infrastructure can indeed be rebuilt by large focus on biodiversity indicators and forestry less intensive than the typical clear-cutting forestry dominating in the north today. This alternative forestry is characterized by longer rotation lengths, more broadleaf trees, continuous cover forestry, which altogether also increase forest functioning, resilience, and other uses. In this particular study, forestry profit was reduced by 14%, but the benefits which we haven't included here is that it increases functioning, resilience, and other use of the forest. Biodiversity is negatively affected by biodiversity that is negatively affected by forestry is projected to increase if green infrastructure is rebuilt. Otherwise, their viability will depend on how large proportion of the forest landscapes that is protected in the form of nature reserves. So overall, sustainable use of forest by rebuilding the green infrastructure means somewhat reduced profit from wood production, yet with increased biodiversity functioning, resilience, and other uses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tord, for this overview of your work. I remind our participants you have the opportunity to to ask questions at the end, and it's a nice transition to indeed these other values and the diverse values and valuation of biodiversity, which we want to highlight now in the context of the second new IBES assessment coming out on this topic next week. So the values assessment is about how different groups of people value nature and its benefits around the world, and the different methods to capture these and account for these in our planning and our decisions. It's clear nature and its benefits are undervalued in our economic and policy decisions, and even more so when it comes to common goods, or when we have multiple uses and benefits of nature elements with multiple beneficiaries, which are hard to capture. So the values assessment in this context is expected to show how values are formed, how they evolve over time, how to also standardize values, and provide guiding principles and actions for integrating the diverse values of nature and its benefits in our decision making. One concrete example from our portfolio of Biodiversa projects is the Connect project. So it exemplifies this well. Amongst others, it looked at how wild food, so from hunting, from picking mushrooms, wild fruits and plants, is valued across the European Union. This topic might seem anecdotal at first, and at the time of this study in 2014, wild food provision was largely overlooked as a benefit of nature for people, or so-called ecosystem service. It's maybe also because the economic and nutritional values of wild food, they are a fraction of the GDP or total consumption of food in Europe. However, for instance, in 2005, wild food harvesting in the EU was valued at a total of 450 million euro, which is not nothing, but definitely really a fraction of the EU food market. However, over 100 million people across the EU consume wild food, and this is projected only to increase in the future. So it raises the question, why is that? What is the value of wild food harvesting and consumption that is being missed in our market value of wild food with this exclusively economic perspective? And so, building on a previous work, Connect provided a synthetic overview of where and why people consume wild food. So as to the why, they showed the relative economic value of wild food in the EU, as I explained. However, they also showed that wild food harvesting and consumption has actually rather, instead of a maybe strong economic value, a very strong cultural value, economic value in the market sense. It has a very strong cultural value to the people and in regions where it is part of the traditions, the cuisine, etc. And so they showed how it's also part of people's identity, For instance, highlighting that when people change regions, they usually actually keep harvesting wild food they were used to in their region of origin, rather than traditional species in their new region. So it's really a part of identity for people practicing wild food harvesting and consumption. And a recurrent motive also they uncovered was simply actually recreation for game species, so hunting, but also mushroom picking, and the provision of overall the provision of a sense of place to people, which kind of weaves through these points of identity and leisure as well. And so as to the where, you can see here, they worked, you can see maps here. What does this correspond to? They developed maps of the demand for wild food, building on their work on valuation of wild food across the EU. So it means at the top, you have a map of, here it's the example of mushroom, and the importance of mushroom as an ecosystem services in terms of occurrence and valuation. And then they mapped, in addition, demand for provision of wild food, demand at the top and provision of wild food at the bottom. And this they built on consumption patterns and also occurrence of a species and diversity of species. And it shows actually a particular large variation in wild food consumption across EU species, across EU countries. And it also, combining these, it allows also to help put this overlooked ecosystem service on the radar of EU policy, and particularly in a very concrete way, you can compare maps of demand with maps of supply and identify mismatches and put in place relevant landscape planning strategies. And so they concretely highlighted this in a EU policy context, and also actually it's interesting to see this was one of the results which was taken up in the in a IBES assessment for Europe and Central Asia, published in 2017. And which highlights the added value of this type of work, really bridging from local to EU or world scale analyses, and their value for this type of broad scale science policy interface activities against these global challenges. Okay, so another example of work on values going on in Biodiversa project is with urbanization, where there are a lot of different groups of people with different uses and values of nature in a condensed place, and with city authorities that have to plan for the development of green and blue spaces in a sustainable and also equitable way for their residents. And to tell you a bit more about this, we have invited Dagmar Haase, who has worked on our URBIS and then Enable projects on highlighting advancing governance of nature in cities for just transition to sustainability and the role of values in this. Dagmar, I give the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frédéric. And I think my slides are shared now by you, right? Okay, then the first slide, please. So, yeah, what is behind greening? We think that our both projects, they work in the urban space, and urban spaces are increasing. They already make up, depending on what reference you use, between 5 to 8% of the globe surface. And you all know that cities are a kind of front runners where we have extremely high densities, but also a lot of knowledge hubs and a lot of things going on that are very fast. Insofar, I think it is very important to make the link between the messages that will be published in the IPBES reports with the urban biodiversity and the research on this. And I think it is very important to understand also the value of biodiversity in these urban systems. There are a lot of people saying, well, urban systems, they are kind of human-made, this is kind of secondary nature, and they are not completely wrong, but it has also an intrinsic value, this biodiversity here, even if it's a bit different from the open land, forest and arable land biodiversity. But it is key to build sustainable and resilient cities. So how do we as urban researchers understand this biodiversity? First of all, we all love nature and we think biodiversity is an intrinsic value that cannot be somehow replaced, that needs to exist. Second, of course, it has a kind of relational value because it has something good for us, right? So there are some functions, we call them ecosystem services, that produce good outcomes for people. And we as scientists, we try to identify, to measure and to model these values. And we use different indicators. We developed some of them in our two projects, Urbis and Enable. And these proxies, they refer to biophysical functions like cooling, like food production, but also for air pollutant fixation. And on the other hand, they also focus on the human side. What is the cultural value? What is the recreational value? And what is the aesthetic appreciation of nature? And I would like to introduce to you 4 small examples. The first examples you see here: trees and urban forests, state and connectivity. Studying cities like Stockholm in Sweden or Łódź in Poland, we found that trees are really key for facing climate change and human, for instance, human heat death in cities, as trees have the capability to cool, to provide oxygen and to fix pollutants. As different tree species we found are differently robust against heat and drought, we found diverse tree canopies of different species are more effective than homogeneous ones. Diverse tree stands also host a maximum of diversity of other species, like birds, carabites, pollinators, and other insects. So they are real creators of co-benefits, as a previous talk has also shown for non-urban areas. And please imagine one of our sample cities, Halle in Germany, they face a change of rainfall of about 40 to 50 millimeters in only 50 years. And when you have a climate balance less than 500 millimeters or less than 600 millimeters, 50 millimeter is enormous. And here trees can help, because not only the connected canopies, but also the connected root systems are especially effective in saving water locally at place, and thus to withstand climate change. So our take-home message here is planting tree diversity along streets and roads, but also creating tree species rich parks belong to the most effective greening measures in cities. But there are also other examples. Next slide, please. There are gardens. We all love gardens. Gardens we find in every city around the globe. And gardens are hosts for biodiversity and social cohesion. We found that gardens are really multifunctionalities. So we found that they produce local food that can contribute to a 5 to 10% vegetable, let's say, supply for local populations, not for whole cities, but for neighborhoods. Their flowers host biodiversity, insects. And so in some of the gardens, we really found an exploding biodiversity. Of course, this is partly designed nature. You can also say it's a secondary nature, but it has an intrinsic value too. What is more, as you see here, the little hats, gardens bring people of different age and education together. And so they are also catalysts of social cohesion, of a real human nature interactions. However, we all know the building pressure in our cities, and so gardens are also affected by this. Gardens have to be saved from this pressure to be built, because they are still in quite central positions in the city. So they are not all in the peripheries. And this is something really important we can do to keep these open spaces. And we found the building pressure in all the cities we studied, ranging from Barcelona, Halle, Stockholm, and Łódź. So that means along the whole European gradient. In different densities, in, let's say, different dynamics and velocities, but we found it. Next slide, please. But there are other green spaces in cities that are kind of unintendedly there. These are the brownfields. And we call the brownfields nature experimental sites. Why? I said climate change is affecting our cities. Of course, climate change also affects the greening measures we place against climate change. And here brownfields come into play because they are not intendedly placed. They exist, they emerge, they remain from abandoned sites. And we discovered brownfields to be really the places where nature experiments and where wild and diverse tree, shrub, and vascular plant communities grow without any kind of human intervention. And it was super interesting to see that in many cities, we find a kind of hybrids, which also get some seeds from the gardens around, which form new habitats, new ecosystems, which can survive without additional water, additional irrigation. And this is really key. And I think there's also a certain need to understand the values of this new biodiversity on artificial substrates partly, but they have their value in particular when we have growing cities and less water resources. And we also concluded that nature itself is partly one of the most effective nature-based solutions because it tells us about adaptation mechanisms, for instance, this hybridization and hybridization. The next slide. This is my last example. Despite this all, nature has also this cultural function for humans. And we need equity to make all these benefits I have spoken about accessible for most of all vulnerable groups. It was really an important issue that they are not fairly distributed in our cities, that also big greening projects are very often in favorite situations, locations, and there are a lot of spaces that still need and qualitatively high greening. So that means our models and our indicators, they approved the importance and the value of biodiversity. And they also showed that they can be very beneficial for facing climate change and for people. But we need more and better ideas how to long-term preserve and fair access, and also long-term preserve experimental sites for nature in cities as they might pave us part of the way. Next slide. With this, I thank you very much for your attention and happy to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dagmar, and also many thanks to Tord and Frédéric for exemplifying the two main topics that will be discussed at the 9th plenary session of the IPES. And I also hope that all of you have been inspired by the findings that have been presented today, and also that these diverse examples can help you to better understand the issues related to sustainable use of wild species, but also to the diverse values of biodiversity. And we're also quite proud to showcase how research and innovation can bring these concrete solutions to the table, but also the pivotal role of European partnerships like Biodiversa Plus in better accounting for nature in our decisions. So with this, I will hand over again to Coralie for a short Q&A session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Hilde, and thank you to all of the speakers that took the floor today. So I now open the floor to you, to questions. So like I mentioned earlier, you can either ask your questions in the chat or by using the hand raising function. And please state your name and your affiliation when you ask your questions so that we can address you properly. So if anyone has any question, please come forward. Okay, well, it looks like our presenters were crystal clear. So I don't know if any of the presenters have questions for or curiosities regarding anything that was addressed today. Okay, I see that we have a question here. So there's a question by Raya, which says, which are the countries with the most green infrastructures? What could you say about the biodiversity in Bulgaria? I don't know who's the best place for this. Maybe Dagmar, you have an idea?
Yeah, so I know Bulgaria, actually this might be an advantage, but I never did the real research. I had a nice excursion with a geographer there, so but I can say something. So we did a study on this European data, Copernicus data and Sentinel data, on the green surface and the NDVI values across entire Europe, all the cities, 900 cities. And it was quite interesting because it was more positive than we thought. So we have an increase in green space, including green roofs, of course, which is not accessible for all, in many, many cities. It is the case that you spoke, Raya, about Bulgaria, southeastern and southwestern Europe, let's say, are not the front runners here. So there's still something to do, but it is increasing the green and also the per capita values. What I found actually in two countries, Bulgaria and in Albania, there is a lot of very, very rich biodiversity in cities, mainly due to the fact that there are sites that are not touched for a long time, which supports the hypothesis we have about these brownfields. And what I can advise you is looking at heavily growing cities, like for instance in the UK, but also in the Netherlands. Look at very wealthy cities in Northern Europe, but also have a look at successful cities dealing with new biodiversity in Eastern Europe, in Poland, Poznan and Łódź, to get a gradient of experiences, maybe to conclude for countries like Bulgaria. But again, I can only say these countries, post-transition or transition countries, they have a real rich biodiversity that is still there. Yeah, maybe so far.
Thank you, Dagmar. Does anyone else have any questions, or maybe one of the speakers does anyone want to add anything on this question?
Maybe just to add that what I find interesting in the projects you've presented, also it's pushing the frontiers of the way we understand and manage nature as well. For instance, Dagmar, you talked about the intrinsic value. Value is often very linked to uses traditionally, and here we see the work also around including the value of nature for itself. And I think also, Tord, it was interesting in your example to hear about you have this reduction of profit by 14%, but actually on the other hand, you have an increase in resilience to extreme events of forests, which can resist better and etc. And actually, we see there's a non-extractive uses of species, and here wild species, which are very much related to solving global challenges. And you both talked about nature-based solutions, and it's key behind this. Looking at management practices, looking at values and uses of green space. It's clear there's additional benefits we are sometimes failing to capture in our decisions. It's about sequestering carbon, reducing temperature. It's about water runoff management. It's about also health benefits. We all realize in the pandemic the role that green spaces played for mental and physical health. So I think it's really interesting to see how research and innovation beyond these big topics, etc., is also challenging us in the way we think and manage our relationship with nature. It's not really a question, but
Thank you. I see that Tord has his hand raised, and then I see we have another question in the chat. So maybe quickly, Tord.
Yes, I agree with what Frédéric said, that the forest management approaches that we apply in building up the green infrastructure, they indeed increase the resilience of forests. They are typically have higher species richness compared to today forests in the Nordic countries, for example, which decreases the risk of pests and pathogens and etc. I also wanted just to add to what Dagmar said about Bulgaria. I know the Environmental European Agency have compiled data on the proportion of area set aside in protected in different countries. And if I recall correctly, Bulgaria ends up being one of the countries that indeed have set aside quite a large proportion compared to other countries in the European Union.
Yeah. Great, thanks a lot. So the question we have in the chat is a question on how will the countries be stimulated to take concrete measures due to the main legislative measures and goals. Does anyone have anything to say about this?
I would say it is countries on the one hand, yes. We work on cities, and cities are not countries. They're of course part of countries, but they're also self-standing bodies. And what we learned is we need the full broad governance of cities. We need on the one hand the municipality, the mayor, and the parliament of the city, and the big planning organizations. On the other hand, there are so many emerging non-governmental civil society-based bodies, and they exchange a lot. Here also, interestingly, during Corona time, the let's say online communication played a big role. But also, I think, coming back to our projects, right? Projects like Biodiversa projects, they always have often have case studies, right? And we invite these case studies, and we look for best practices, and we look for a free exchange about, let's say, what went well, what went wrong, what are experiences. And this is for the cities, as I experience, the most beneficial, that they see how things work and they can adapt this to their own conditions. And insofar, I think it is definitely a top-down, bottom-up process, right? And what we also saw is that different cities have different countries have different traditions. So you cannot, let's say, require that all is done in a very bottom-up way, like we, for instance, know it in the Netherlands. On the other hand, we also have systems that work well with a bit more top-down working. And what I learned is that I have to accept this, and it works well when you primarily accept your way of working. Then you can really exchange experiences. Yeah, maybe so far to my experiences here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dagmar. I think you actually you wrapped up very nicely the messages we wanted to share with you today. So thank you again for joining. We will be sending you the slides as well, so that you have a bit of material to sink your teeth in. And like I mentioned, if you have any questions regarding this event, you can always email us at communication@biodiversa.org. And with this, I will close the session. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the speakers as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.